Welcome back to the podcast. I have a somewhat frequent guest, Michael Katz, back on. Michael's always been on before talking about his campaigns for GoFundMe project. This is Michael's first time on the regular podcast. Michael, tell the fans a little bit about yourself.
Okay, I am a lawyer by day and a comic creator by night. I've been doing crowdfunding for the last, I'd say, 4 years. I've been pretty successful. I've been working with a lot of great members of the industry, Ron Mars, Daryl Banks, Keith Champagne, Kevin McGuire, Neto Diaz, Jack Herbert, and I've been reading comics for maybe 50 years. I love them.
So when I asked you to come on the podcast, came up with a topic, you decided to pick Frank Miller's Daredevil. Why?
Miller is a big influence on my own creations in terms of writing and art direction. I don't draw my own books, although I like to think I'm not the worst with the pencil in my hand. But there's something with Miller's style that I've always related to. And I think there are certain aspects of his storytelling abilities that I bring to my own projects.
So I was putting together some notes for this. I did some digging around, and I didn't realize Miller really didn't have a long resume in comic books prior to Daredevil. He did a couple of things for DC in 78. His first Marvel was in John Carter, Warlord of Mars number 18 in 78. Then in 79, he did a two-part story of Spectacular Spider-Man, which did guest star Daredevil. I guess Frank Miller approached Joe Duffy, who was a staffer at the time, who he considers a mentor and calls her his guardian angel. Duffy conveyed to Miller's interest that he wanted to work on Daredevil to then editor-in-chief Jim Shooter, which approved Miller as the new penciler for Daredevil beginning in 1979 with Daredevil 178. Were you into Daredevil back in the 1970s, or did you learn to appreciate Daredevil later on?
I did read Daredevil not regularly. There were quite a few books I collected as soon as I started getting into comics. But Daredevil was one that I read infrequently. I read it basically for the villains. I still remember I have Bullseye's original appearances. I think Marv Wolfman was the one that created him for Marvel Comics. But I didn't read him frequently because he was actually lame. I think his supervillains were the lamest part about him. You had multiple appearances by the Stilt Man, the Jester, the Man Bull, and the Beetle, which was even borrowed from Spider-Man. So it's hard to care about the book when he doesn't fight anybody of import.
Yeah, when Miller started drawing it, it was one of Marvel's poor selling titles, and it was a bi-monthly title. And you describe some of the ways of it lost its way in the 70s. So when you think of Miller's earliest work, when you're starting to pencil it, did you see glimmers of what he would become one day?
Yeah, it's funny because as things went on, his art style changed pretty drastically, I think. Yeah, I believe he got his start in the industry thanks to Neil Adams discovering him. And I can see a little bit of Neil Adams' cleaner lines in his earlier stuff. And also, I see a lot of Gene Colan in his work. I've never been a big fan of Gene Colan. I always thought he was a little too messy, but he was stylish. He had a style all his own. If you look at the very first page of Daredevil 178, it looks like Gene Colan could have done that page himself in his earlier days.
So
You know,
go on.
Yeah, they both had an knack for facial expressions and for dynamic layouts.
So when Miller was first starting out, before he was writing, did he stand out among the other Marvel artists even at that time? Even though he didn't have a
I,
big resume?
I think he did. He had a film noir look where he really focused on backgrounds and made the city of New York and Hell's Kitchen like almost a living, breathing character in the books. And he also had a very exciting way of doing layouts. I think he must have had a bit of a manga influence to him because, yeah, he brought a lot of martial arts and ninja influences to the book when he became the writer. But he had that martial arts feel to Daredevil's actions.
So when he became writer in 81 with 168, it went immediately from bi-monthly to a monthly status. And that would also have the first introduction of Elektra. Could you, looking back, see a big change in Daredevil from when he first started writing?
Back then, the Marvel method was where the quote unquote writer would just give a plot to the artist, and the artist would go ahead and basically create the story, and then the writer would go back and fill in dialogue. So I imagine that Frank Miller was more involved in the storytelling than you're you would think a penciler would be. And even though it was written by Roger McKenzie at the time, and Miller, I don't think he was a big fan of Roger McKenzie's writing. And I think he tried to get his own influences in the book as much as possible. And I think he wormed his way in and made it more of his own. And that's probably what helped open the door for him getting the full-time writing gig from Jim Shooter.
Like Peter David, since Daredevil was not a big seller at the time and Marvel really didn't care what he did, so he had pretty much free reign. Do you think as a title was a better selling title that at the time Frank Miller would have still have had a lot of free reign that he did?
That's a pretty good question. I would say no, because at the time Miller was a nobody. His work for DC was just a couple of short stories. So he really only had a couple full issues under his belt. And it took a while for Daredevil to go from bi-monthly to monthly. So it took a while for his to build the audience for Daredevil. So it would have taken him some time to create the groundswell to get the people on his side to let him do whatever he wanted to do with the character.
So Miller wrote that first time around for about 2 years, from 168 to 191. And again, we're talking about something that's decades in the past, and most comic fans weren't even around reading comic books during that time. Does his first run stand up over time?
Oh, definitely. The reason I'm here talking about it is because I still think it's amazing stuff. It became a popular book for a number of reasons, and I think it helped bring in the street level hero that is so popular today. It was probably like the grandfather of all those books. If you look at the heroes that show up on TV, like on Netflix, their popularity really started with Miller's Daredevil. And he also borrowed the Kingpin from Spidey's book and turned him into a real dark character. So the one that you see on TV today, we have Frank Miller to thank.
Were there any misses in your opinion during that first run?
I Yeah, it's funny because I was never a fan of the inker, Klaus Janson. He had been working for Marvel for a while before Miller came along. But as Miller became busier, he started doing layouts only, and Jansen did the finished art. And it was often a little messier than Miller's line work, which wasn't especially clean to begin with. But it was often hard to tell where Miller ended and Jansen started. I think as the title progressed, the art got messier but it was still Miller's book from beginning to end.
Don't you think Elektra was a very much out of the box character when she was first introduced?
Yeah, Miller, like I said, he was into to manga and Japanese culture, and he created Elektra, the hand, stick, the chased. He drew the first Wolverine miniseries, which took place in Japan. I think he co-plotted that book with Chris Claremont. So I think in the 70s, there was a big influx of martial arts. You had Iron Fist and Shang-Chi, White Tiger. You had Trade Size Comics featuring these guys before they got their own series. So martial arts was big, but I think it was Miller that brought the Japanese culture and the Japanese martial arts into the comic industry.
So, where do you think Miller's first run on Daredevil ranks in all-time classics of Daredevil history?
I think it's the top because it started the ball rolling. Daredevil was a lame Spider-Man ripoff before Miller came along. Yeah, he was just like a devil may care swashbuckler who fought a different villain each month. And Miller came along and grounded him and created a lot of the backstory that we know today and created a lot of the characterization, like the religious guy who's always feeling lost, is always losing his connection with God. And then all these characters like Elektra, when you think Daredevil, you think Elektra and Bullseye. And he made Bullseye the badass that we know Bullseye is today. Bullseye ranks up there with the best villains around. And he had a couple appearances before Miller came along, but he was nowhere near as important a villain as he was until Miller got his hands on him.
Would it be a fair assessment on your part to say that the Daredevil we know today is much more Frank Miller than anything?
Oh, definitely. That's a good way to put it because other than the fact that he was a blind character and a lawyer, all the other lore was created by Miller. And everything we see thereafter, from Bendis to Zdarsky doing it today, all that background comes from Miller's creation.
We could actually literally, I purposely made this podcast to the early days of Miller, but we could talk an hour about Miller and we still wouldn't get into the essence of how important Miller was to Daredevil. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, he was on Daredevil for a while. He left, he came back, he did another seminal work called Daredevil Born Again, which retold the origin. And he also brought in a lot of influences that other people took and ran with afterwards.
What if Frank Miller were to come back to Daredevil? Do you think he would enjoy it? Would it be something similar to what we have today?
I don't think he would enjoy it. I think he got tired of working for the big two, Marvel and DC. He left them maybe the 80s to work for indie comics and now he does his own stuff. And I think he likes the fact that he has total control over anything he does. I know in 2011 he did that book Holy Terror, which was originally supposed to be a Batman story, but they thought it was too violent or too unlike Batman's character, DC Comics to accept it. So he created his own character and turned it into something starring a guy called the Fixer. But when you read it, it's a Batman book. And I reread a bunch of my Miller stuff over the last week to prepare for today's show. And I reread that too. And yeah, it was disappointing. His art has really gone downhill. It's more of a caricature than what he used to be. And his writing style is, I think, is also more caricaturish. I used to be a huge fan of his stuff. Ronin, Batman, The Dark Knight, and Batman Year One were amazing projects. But once he started doing stuff, All Star Batman and Robin with Jim Lee, that was critically panned, and that was just terrible stuff. You got Batman cursing at Robin. You got a bunch of things that he worked on. I love 300 in Sin City, but as he goes on, he gets more conservative, and I think people don't like that form of storytelling, and it shows in his work.
So when you reread your Daredevil preparing for this, it still felt fresh and good and like almost a complete arc, right?
Definitely. It's rare that something from 1979 is going to be as viable today. Usually you go back and even you can reread your favorite run of Claremont and Burns X-Men and think some of this stuff is kind of lame.
And
Right.
but you're right, Daredevil with Miller, it does not feel dated. You could
It's
fit it right into today's Daredevil and it still read just as well.
exactly.
We are going to wrap this up on Frank Miller Daredevil. It was a very good topic. Thank you, Michael, for coming on. Any closing comments?
Yeah, I haven't bought anything from Miller in a long time. I'll flip through his work once in a while, but it's a shame his work just doesn't thrill me today because he influenced me immensely. My own Riot Earp book owes a great deal to Miller's style, I think. And you can't go wrong looking back at his older stuff from Marvel and DC.
Michael Katz, one of my favorite guests on the show. Thank you for joining me, and I'm going to figure out a way to get you back on the show again.
Thanks for having me.